So let's move on now to Dana Glenn, who is coming to us from UC Riverside, around the corner from me. And she is going to talk about age and stimulus type influence the association between multi-voxel threat representations and explicit memory during generalization. And so Dana, why don't you go ahead and share your screen and take it away for us.
All right, thank you. Let's see. Okay.
Looks good to me.
Cool.
All right, take it away.
All right, great. So as Megan mentioned, my name's Dana Glenn. I'm a graduate student at UC Riverside, and I'll be presenting some preliminary work looking at how age and stimulus type affects threat representation during threat generalization. So this is similar to some work that we've published on in the past. So if you'd like to check that out, Megan's going to drop that in the chat. Due to some time constraints, I can't dive into the methods in as much detail as I want to, and so some of that will be on that paper. And of course, you're also welcome to ask me any questions. So fear is a very important emotion. Although it's unpleasant, it is an adaptive mechanism that allows us to predict, react to, and adjust to threat in order to avoid both present and future danger. Humans and animals can anticipate potential danger by applying previous knowledge about threats to novel situations. So threat generalization is the ability to identify features of stimuli or situations that resemble those linked to a past threat, and it's essential to our ability to learn about threats. So one important feature of a threat stimulus might be whether or not it has social implications. Because humans have evolved to work within complex societies, it's important for success and for possibly for survival that we can precisely remember who is a friend and who is a foe. And while non-social threats can also pose significant danger, they might be more easily categorized as threatening or non-threatening. So for example, if this woman screamed at you, it would probably be beneficial not only to remember her, but to be able to tell her apart from other similar looking women. On the other hand, if this bear attacked you and you somehow survived, it would probably be a good idea to just avoid all bears in the future. You can categorize them all as dangerous without making judgments about subtle differences in how they look. So the specificity with which you need to distinguish between threatening and ambiguous stimuli may influence how much you generalize knowledge about learned threat to other situations. And there's research to suggest that stimulus type does influence threat learning. So people display stronger conditioning to evolutionarily relevant threats, and this conditioning is more resistant to extinction. But few studies have directly compared threat generalization elicited by social versus non-social stimuli. So our first research question was to test whether threat representations are influenced by social context. And we examined fear ratings and neural activation in several brain regions implicated in threat learning and threat generalization in a group of both adolescents and adults. So we were also interested, how does this change across development? The ability to differentiate between threatening and ambiguous stimuli increases with age differences persisting into adolescence. And so there's research to suggest that adults may show greater prefrontal cortex engagement, making threat safety discriminations, while adolescents might rely on earlier maturing subcortical structures. But to date, no studies have examined developmental differences in generalization of social versus non-social threat. So we wanted to examine whether developmental differences emerge during threat generalization and whether stimulus-related differences in threat generalization interacted with age. So our participants were an ethnically diverse sample of 16 adolescents and 20 adults recruited at the NIMH. And over the course of 4 visits, they completed 2 conditioning and extinction recall paradigms. One was a social threat paradigm and one was a non-social threat paradigm. So in visit 1 and visit 3, participants completed conditioning and extinction. During social threat conditioning, they saw pictures of 2 female faces. One of the faces, the CS plus, was paired with a fearful face and a loud scream. You might remember her. While the other face, the CS minus, was not. And in the non-social threat conditioning task, the conditioned stimuli were yellow and blue bells, and the CS plus was paired with the loud aversive alarm sound. So 3 weeks after each conditioning visit, at visits 2 and 4, participants underwent an in-scanner extinction recall task. So they viewed the CS minus, CS plus, and then an array of morphed images with different blends of the CS plus. And participants were asked one of two questions, either how afraid are you, which measures their threat appraisal, or how likely was this woman to scream or bell to ring, measuring their explicit memory of the conditioning event. So just to be clear, it's data from this visit that we're analyzing moving forward. So we used representational similarity analysis to measure pairwise dissimilarity in the patterns of neural activation elicited by each stimulus. So for example, you would take the correlation between the yellow bell and the green bell, take 1 minus that correlation, that gives you a dissimilarity value, and you input those into a dissimilarity matrix, and you get out of that one dissimilarity matrix for each brain area and subject for each task. So first we wanted to characterize the shape of the neural generalization gradients. And so for this, we were interested in how neural representations elicited by each generalization stimuli or morphed stimulus compared to the representation of the true threat stimulus, the CS plus. And so we ran a linear model with these comparisons, including age and task as factors, as well as linear and quadratic trends to characterize the shape of the generalization gradients. So here I've plotted the similarity of the neural patterns elicited by each of the generalization stimuli versus the CS plus, the true threat stimulus. The social task is plotted in red and the non-social task is plotted in blue. So we're comparing the similarity of neural patterns elicited by these generalization stimuli to the CS plus. So these are along the x-axis. So because we were interested in the shape of these gradients, I've plotted lines of best fit to just help visualize these shapes. We found an interaction between task and gradient pattern. So we found that social stimuli followed a linear generalization gradient. So here, for example, you can see it's linear. So whereas the non-social stimuli followed a quadratic generalization gradient across all regions. So meaning that in the social task, as stimuli increasingly resembled the threat stimulus, patterns of neural activation also resembled those elicited by the CS plus. On the other hand, in the non-social threat task, people showed increased similarity between the CS plus and the CS minus. So participants' neural activity during the non-social task reflected poor threat safety discrimination. We also ran a similar analysis on the behavioral ratings, and we found the same result where social stimuli elicited a linear generalization gradient across both threat appraisal and explicit memory conditions. And the non-social stimuli elicited a quadratic pattern of activation. So now that we've characterized the shape of the generalization gradients, we wanted to know how closely aligned are the neural representations with the subject's explicit memory of the conditioning event. So to compare the self-report and neural activity, we converted the explicit memory ratings into a dissimilarity matrix. So we've taken the absolute value of the difference between each score and put that into the matrix. And these matrices were averaged within each group and task. And we correlated the dissimilarity matrix for each region of interest to the appropriate behavior matrix via a Spearman correlation. And so this resulted in one brain behavior correlation for each subject in each task and region of interest. We then looked at the influence of age, task, and region of interest on behavior brain correlations using repeated measures ANOVA. And so here the brain behavioral correlations are plotted for the social and the non-social task for adults and youth. Social is plotted in red, non-social in blue, and adults are in the darker color and youth are in the lighter color. So first we found a main effective task such that social stimuli elicit greater brain behavior correlations across all region of interests and age groups. We also observed a main effective age where adults demonstrated greater brain behavior correlations than youth. And finally, we see an age by task by region of interest interaction. So in the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, adults showed greater brain behavior correlations in the social task than the non-social task, but we didn't see this difference for adolescents. And by contrast, in the dorsal anterior singular cortex, adolescents but not adults showed greater brain behavior correlations in the social task compared to the non-social task. So we examined representations of social and non-social threats generalization among adults and adolescents, and 3 key findings emerged from this study. So first, we saw that for both adults and adolescents, neural activity patterns followed a linear generalization gradient for social stimuli and a quadratic gradient for non-social stimuli. So the different patterns we observed across tasks suggest that socially relevant threat stimuli may elicit enhanced threat safety discriminations compared to non-social stimuli. And as mentioned earlier, this may be due to a need to have more precise recognition of social threat stimuli. Discrimination for socially relevant stimuli may be supported by humans' unique face processing abilities. So face processing occurs in specialized neural pathways, and faces are processed holistically, which may allow better discrimination between subtle differences in facial identity. So we also wanted to probe whether developmental differences emerged during threat generalization. And we observed a main effect on age on brain behavior correlations, with adults showing greater brain behavior correlations than youth. So one possible cause for this age difference is that adults may have greater access to autonomic threat detection processes than adolescents. So as interoceptive ability increases with age, it might allow adults to utilize physiological cues that result from activating threat relevant networks, which then they could use to inform explicit ratings of threat. Again, this design doesn't speak to this directly, so it's just a hypothesis. And then our third aim was to probe which brain regions perform differentially across social and non-social threat generalization, and whether this interacted with age. So we found that adults' brain behavior correlations to the vmPFC were greater for social stimuli than for non-social stimuli, but we didn't see these differences for adolescents. So the vmPFC is central in fear inhibition. During extinction recall, vmPFC activity increases as stimuli should resemble the safety cue. And so the vmPFC is still developing through adolescence, so adults may be better equipped to regulate autonomic threat responses to these safe stimuli or the CS+, CS-, to align better with their memory of the threat conditioning event. Alternatively, we found that adolescents' brain behavior correlations in the dACC were greater for social stimuli than for non-social stimuli, but we didn't see these differences for adults. So the dACC is involved in conscious appraisal of fear response, and there's some evidence for developmental differences in dACC response to threat-related stimuli. Adolescents showed increased dACC activation relative to adults when they viewed threat-related face stimuli, and this response was modulated by emotional expression. So while adults may engage the developed prefrontal cortex to make threat safety discriminations, adults seem to be relying on regions in the salience network to make such distinctions. And this could be important in studying aberrations in threat generalization, which are related to disorders like anxiety. Okay, so I think that's my time. So just want to thank my collaborators, Kalina Mihalska, Megan Peters, and Danny Pine, and the research teams at the NIMH and UC Riverside.
Great, thank you very much, Dana. And if you enjoyed the talk, please drop a note in the chat because we cannot applaud here on Zoom webinar. So thank you again, Dana, for a great talk. If you do have questions for Dana, please drop them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And as we're waiting for some questions to come in, because we have a couple minutes, Dana, I'll ask a question if that's okay. So it looked like in one of your plots, there were negative brain behavior correlations. Do you think you could comment on that just a little bit? What does that mean to have a negative brain behavior correlation?
Yeah, so this I've been thinking about because I was initially kind of confused about this, and I don't have an answer for that. But what I think is happening is, since for these ratings, we're comparing the whole dissimilarity matrix. And so, you know, for the first plots, it was just versus the threat rating. Now we're comparing each threat stimulus to each other. And so looking at some of the neural dissimilarity matrices, I don't think I have them here. It looked like there may have been more differentiation for the CS-. So I'm seeing more differentiation in some of the neural plots up here, which we're not seeing in the ratings. And so I think that might be driving kind of this like opposite effect where it's giving us a negative rating. So I'm not quite sure what to make of that, but I think that's maybe it's that there is more differentiation in neural patterns to the safety stimuli that is not represented in the behavior ratings.
Great. Things to look into in the future. Fantastic. Okay, well, if you have any remaining questions for Dana, please do drop them in the chat or in the Q&A, and we can answer in text-based format. So thanks again, Dana, for the great talk, and we will go ahead and move on to our final speaker for this.